Ladies and gentlemen, by the end of this video, you will know not only how to play, but how to beat the two knights variation of the Caro Kann defense. So, let's get started right away. This is kind of the starting position of the two knights defense, or the two knights variation, I apologize. And it arises from the move order e4, c6, knight c3, d5, and knight f3. And it feels like a hybrid between the classical and sort of the exchange variation, and we will see that later on. And I feel like the two knights variation is slightly inaccurate for white to play, but it leads to some of the most fun and interesting positions you can get in the Caro Kann. So let's quickly talk about some of the plans and ideas before we move on to the actual theory. This is the sort of position that you will encounter a lot, and everything here is very important to understand. The reason I didn't include any other pieces is because I feel like they would serve as distractions, whereas this is really all you need to know, and the placement of these pieces will dictate how you play it. For example, if you run into h3 in this sort of position where there's a pawn on e4, you want to slide back. You do not want to take this knight. The reason for that is because if you were to capture this knight, you would reinforce this e4 pawn, and now this capture would not be possible since there are two pieces defending the e4 pawn. This would be a very pleasant position for white. Now, likewise, if white were to start with e5 and kick this knight out, we always want to we always want to reroute this knight over to d7 because this is a very nice square for the knight. It allows for c5 ideas, and later on we would develop our b8 knight to c6. And this knight targets this e5 square as well. And in this position, if you were to get hit with h3, for example, you always want to take this knight because now this pawn is hanging. Any other scenario where there's a pawn on e5 and you're ready to play c5 and you get hit with h3, just take this knight and you don't have to worry about that. That's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is this d-pawn. If it gets pushed to d3, this is extremely passive for white, as even though it reinforces this e4 pawn, we never really plan on taking it anyway. And I'm going to show you guys an example of how to punish this later on. But the main move in a lot of variations of the two knights variation is d4 to support the push to e5. And we never really mind that. Whenever we see d4, we always know we have this c5 idea where we plan to place a knight on c6 and use our bishop. Alternatively, sometimes this bishop will also stay on f1 and you'll just get h3 right away. In those sort of variations where h3 happens right away, we always just take this knight and there would be a queen here, which would recapture the bishop. Let's get into the actual theory of things now. So in the two knights, there's really only two variations which get played, and one of them is a lot more popular than the other. And the most popular move here is h3. I'm going to show you guys the bishop e2, which is the second most popular move first, because you're going to face it a lot over any skill level. Here we're going to just immediately play e6. Now we have this nice triangular light square pawn structure. We block our bishop out of our pawn chain because, well, if it ever gets threatened, we can always trade it. And in that way, we'll have replaced our light square bishop with light square pawns, making the opponent's light square bishop very passive in the sense that it doesn't have any, activity over any of these squares since they're all taken up with our light square pawns. Also, if this trade was to ever occur, this is great for us because this is like an improved version of the exchange variation, because now we've already brought this bishop out. We have very, very easy development. And then we just have even more space. We have two central pawns, so this would be great for black. So if this trade ever occurs, just know you can take with the c pawn and you're going to be very, very happy. But the main move here is just castles. And here we bring our knight out to f6. This move has two purposes. First of all, it obviously targets this pawn, since now there are two pieces attacking it. Additionally, it also acts as a sort of baiting move, because we want to see e5, and we want to slide our knight back to d7. I guarantee you, this will happen in like 99% of your games. The opponent is going to play e5 in one way or another. You're going to have to reroute to d7. And this position is completely fine for black. It looks a little bit cramped, but we can very quickly change that. The opponent will play d4 almost every single time, and the purpose of that is just to reinforce this pawn to avoid losing it. And here we can play c5. I would really recommend starting with bishop e7 first, because we want to prevent bishop g5 ideas. So if we were to start with c5, bishop g5 would be very unpleasant, because, we have to move our queen, and now white has a little bit better development. So to start with bishop e7, the c5 move is not going anywhere. Now this bishop has a hard time coming out to a nice square. So let's say I'm going to play a random move. Now we can immediately strike with c5. And the point is that we're going to place a knight on c6. If this trade ever occurs, we can just take with the knight or the bishop. It really doesn't matter. I would say taking the bishop's actually better. And here we're very happy because knight c6 is coming, queen c7, and we're going to win this pawn. This knight is going to get dislodged, so we're either going to take it with the bishop or just going to have to move. There's not going to be enough pieces to protect this e5 square. If white decides to not take, and let's say plays h3, once again, if you refer back to our plans and ideas kind of section of this video, you will know that this pawn got pushed. That means we take this knight, and now we can trade. And after knight c6, we just win a free pawn. There's literally no defense here. So once again, very quickly, if h3, if there's a pawn on e4 and a bishop on e2, we slide back. If the pawn got pushed, we can take this knight. After the bishop recaptures, we notice one thing. We can capture this pawn, and whichever piece recaptures, we can attack it with tempo with knight c6, after which the capture of this pawn is inevitable. But let's say rook e1 trying to hang out to the pawn. Here, all of white's resources will be dedicated to protecting this pawn. We can just castle, and then next up, we're going to play queen c7. So I'm just going to go through some moves of engine lines. Yeah, so queen b8 here, but queen c7 is totally possible as well. The queen cannot move because then this bishop hangs, so there's literally no protection, and you just win a free pawn. Which would be great for us. This position would be -1 point something for black. So once again, we really like any sort of ideas with e5. Very, very beneficial for black because this d7 reroute with c5 always works out well. However, more prepared opponents will not allow this to happen. They will not play e5, and here they will play the immediate h3. Once again, if you refer back to our kind of plans and ideas, this pawn is on e4. There's a bishop on e2. We do not want to take this knight now because then it will just reinforce this e4 square. So we're going to drop the bishop back to h5, and that way we still continue to apply pressure. And here there's a couple of moves for white. I mean, the most obvious one is d3. If white plans to play on ambitiously with something like d4, remember that this pawn is hanging. So after this trade occurs, white is down a piece. So obviously, that isn't likely to happen. If d3, extremely passive position for white, we can just calmly develop and we're going to be completely fine. Like bishop e7, castles, and then you have d4 ideas even to expand in the center since white isn't contesting the center. e4, c5, e5, knight c6, queen c7, rook c8. Very easy development, very nice position, and it leads to very interesting games because it's one of those rare variations where white actually doesn't have a space advantage whatsoever. So black is actually able to create sort of attacks and counterplay in these sort of positions. Now let's cover the move h3, which is the most played move in the database in this two knights variation. After h3, we can either slide back or take this knight. However, I prefer to take this knight. The difference from the last position where I recommended slide back was there was a bishop on e2, and in this case there isn't. So I like this position a lot more in terms of taking the knight. We're going to play e6 and solidify. If this capture ever happens, once again, we're very happy. This is like an improved exchange variation because we've traded off our light square bishop. We've replaced it with light square pawns. Here we have even g6 ideas where we can just put all of our pawns on light squares. But really our development is super simple, like knight c6, play g6, bishop g7, or just bishop d6, knight f6, knight e7, whichever moves you like probably work out very well. So just play calmly. You can expand with a minority attack. This is something that is also an idea. So the minority attack is definitely a big possibility. Yeah, this is going to be completely fine for black. Obviously, if this trade doesn't happen, we have some theory here. So after the move d4, we're going to play knight f6. And it's very similar to the previous variation. So the main differences are there's a bishop on e2, and sometimes you don't want to take, the knight. But the ideas here are pretty much the same. If e5, once again, knight d7, we're planning on c5 and knight c6. Everything is the exact same, so we don't really have to cover that. One thing we do have to cover is this very interesting move, bishop d3. And this leads to a little bit of a complication, but we can actually win a pawn here. So we can take this pawn, only the bishop can recapture because obviously otherwise the queen would be hanging. And then we can capture this pawn for free. And white compensates with bishop e3, so white gets more active development for a pawn, but according to the engine and according to games played by other people, this has never really worked out well for white. One thing you have to know is just the right moves to play, so don't make your position very passive. You can simply drop your knight back one square and then prepare bishop b4. Your goal will be to try and trade off as many pieces as you can because white's whole idea is to create some sort of big attack on you using this active development. And if white doesn't have any pieces, then there's no attack to be made, right? So So yeah, drop your queen back, develop your knight, develop your bishop, pin this knight if you can, trade the queen if you can, aim to take this bishop, position will be perfectly fine. That's just something to remember, because sometimes why we'll try this, and against unsuspecting opponents, it can actually turn out pretty dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Let's say this queen goes here. This position's already pretty passive, and I'd say white is a little bit better here, just if they follow like some moves with castling. If we see a random move with, like, let's say bishop to e3, here, very simply, we're going to play very disciplined. We're going to bring our bishop out, pin this knight, and we're going to aim to take this pawn, because now it's very vulnerable, as you can see. So if this bishop gets attacked, we're going to trade, and then we're going to be up a pawn. So in a lot of variations where the move d4 is played, this e4 pawn can become a pretty large target, and we don't really have to worry about much in these sort of variations. Additionally, white can also sometimes play d3, for example, just to reinforce this pawn, but this is very passive, and I'm going to show you guys exactly why it's passive with a game that was played between Tigran Petrosian and Bobby Fischer. And Tigran Petrosian was notorious for, playing the Caro Kann. He's very good at it. He is very good at the two knights variation as well. So this is a very, very nice game. I'm not going to show you guys the whole game. It was like 60 plus moves. I'm just going to show you the main ideas and reinforce a few of the concepts of how to punish. Very passive play from white. Sorry. So we get this position that we discussed. He chooses to play knight f6 first. However, it doesn't matter, because he could have started with e6. There's really no major difference. And here we get this d3 move. Plays e6. Bobby Fischer plans to fianchetto the bishop, but this is sort of non-traditional for these variations. And because these variations were, relatively new, players were not familiar with them, right away, Petrosian pinned this knight to the king. So remember how I said in this two knights variation, it's one of the rare variations where the Caro Kann player, it actually has more space than white. This is exactly what happens in this game. As we can see, Tigran takes as much space as possible. They are not targets, by the way. They may seem overextended, but there's no real way to target them. For example, this position is super closed, so creating some sort of attack on the pawn is going to be very difficult from white's perspective. And considering this knight is also protecting this pawn. And just a couple of moves down the line, I want to show you guys kind of how this played out. I'm going to speed through these moves, but you basically get the whole idea of pushing these pawns, taking as much central control as you can in order to punish passive play, because that is exactly how you punish passive play, by playing aggressively. And which is something that you don't see a very often in the Caro Kann, but something that should be studied and monitored if you want to play this sort of variation well. And I'm just blitzing through the moves here because they aren't exactly relevant to this position. For example, the chances of you getting this exact game are minuscule, and I say close to 0. And just a few moves down the line, we can see that this pawn has become very advanced. All of these pawns are getting pushed, so it was sort of like a minority attack attempt that turned into just two connected passed pawns. And here, white has no chances of winning simply because these pawns are way too advanced. So by taking extra space, black was able to push his pawns and create opportunities for promotion. And I'm just going to skip to the very end of the game to show you guys. I will include the PGN in the description of this video. So if you guys are interested in studying this game, feel free to do so. It will be in the description, so you can just copy and paste it into any PGN reader. You can do it in chess.com, Lichess, whatever thing you use for analysis. And in this position, Bobby Fischer resigned because he cannot stop these pawns from promoting. And, black is completely dominating here. Last but not least, I just want to go over some key concepts that I think we should always keep in mind. So bishop g4, right away we have to play it. If we get h3, we just trade the knight. If bishop e2, keep in mind what I said at the beginning of this video, and how to differentiate between when you should take the bishop or not. This rule is very easy to follow, and it will help you a lot. And then very simply, e6, knight f6. If this pawn attacks your knight, drop it, play c5. If it doesn't, you're going to expand in the center with moves like d5, c5, and e5. You're going to bring this bishop out. You're going to castle, and you're going to be very happy. That sums up everything I wanted to show you guys for the Caro Kann two knights variation. I hope you found this video useful and informative, and if you did, please consider checking out the video to my left. As always, thank you guys for watching. Hope to see you in the future video.